Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle with my co-host Richard Ebeling. Richard, as many of you know, is teaching economics at the Citadel. He was previously, to that time, president of the Foundation for Economic Education. He taught at Northwood University. He was the Ludwig von Mises professor at Hillsdale College. And, of course, for about the first 15 years or so, he was vice president of academic affairs for FFF. You know, Richard, we often hear the term central planning. You and I have used that term ourselves. It's a phrase that I would venture to say most Americans are not familiar with. But it really is an aspect of socialism. We often think in terms of socialism being a system where the state owns everything, or where the state takes money from one person and gives it to another person. But we generally are not as familiar with the concept of central planning. Certainly the Russian people are familiar with it. This was one of the central constructs of the Soviet socialist economic system. So I thought what we would do today is discuss some of the socialist apparatuses in America's economic structure and political structure in the context of central planning. And one of these, you and I alluded to this in the last couple of weeks, is with respect to the Federal Reserve. Now, you have this debate going on within especially conservative circles. Should the Fed be audited or should it be reformed? And, of course, we libertarians would add a third choice, and that is, should the Fed be abolished? Now, I'll give you my shorthand rendition, and then I'll turn over to you. But it seems to me that, you know, auditing the Fed, yeah, that is something important. You've got this super secret agency. There's no telling what they've done, because we all know that when government operates in secrecy, that means unlimited government, omnipotent government. They're going to be doing some very bad things if they know they're never going to be called to account. So that's why the Fed, in my opinion, has long resisted Ron Paul's call to audit that institution. But to me, auditing is just a step. That this is a socialist central planning construct. There is no way to reform it. It has created untold damage, as we've talked about in a previous issue of the Libertarian Angle. They've totally debased our currency. And that's why we don't have gold and silver coins anymore, because they've debased it to such an extent that the bad money drove out the good. I say that the only real solution to this is a free market monetary system which necessarily involves not reforming the Fed, not auditing it, but getting rid of it entirely, abolishing it. What do you think?
Well, the short answer is I agree with you. But if I may sort of put this in some context for the viewers, let's start off what is meant by central planning, because this is the core concept, as you rightly pointed out. In the 19th century, when socialism began to emerge as first an ideological and then a political force, slowly but surely, their core argument was that capitalism, that is the private competitive enterprise system, besides being, quote, exploitive of the workers, was inefficient and wasteful, and was more concerned with production for profit rather than for the needs of the people. With that particular interpretation, virtually all brands of socialism, but certainly Karl Marx and what became the Marxian socialists and communists, argued that the institutional goal of a socialist revolution would be the abolition through expropriation and nationalization of the means of production. The government would take over land, factories, machinery, tools, resources, raw materials, and in the name of the people would undertake production guided by a central blueprint plan for the economy as a whole. And therefore, obviously, as an element of that, the government would now be the employer of all those desirous or needing work, because there'd be no longer private businessmen hiring. And that since it would be the government hiring people instead of the private sector, the government acting and serving as the trustee of the people's ownership of things would, of course, never exploit or abuse the workers. Now, that was the premise of it. When it finally came to fruition, most especially with the coming of the Russian Revolution in 1917 and Lenin and the Bolsheviks triumphantly coming to power after a rather bloody 2.5-3 year civil war in Russia, they began experiments first partly in the 1920s and then under Stalin in the 1930s, a full nationalization of the means of production. No private property in the means of production at all. And that involved the government planning from the center, the government the only owner, the only producer, and the only employer, and the only distributor. It has taken many forms, as we talked about last week when we were talking about FDR and the New Deal. Central planning need not occur through government ownership of the means of production. The fascist model, first implemented by Mussolini in Italy and then copied by Hitler shortly after he came to power in Germany, was not to nationalize the means of production, but to force all businesses and workers into government-mandated either cartels for enterprises or compulsory unions for workers. And then the government directed how they were to go about their economic affairs through setting wages, prices, setting production targets, goals, and purposes, and determining the distribution of the output and the level and distribution of the income and so on. So planning, central planning, government direction of economic affairs can take its form either through the Soviet model of full nationalization or the Italian Nazi model of nominally on paper private ownership. The government tells businessmen what they can do, how they can do, and what they can charge. That model is basically how the U.S. monetary system is run. If one understands it in the following context, the government has, under the Charter of the Federal Reserve, a legal monopoly control over the issuance of what's called legal tender. That is the lawful money. That's the coins in our pocket that actually the Treasury mints, or the dollars that are printed up, or are sort of our computer money, which are the Federal Reserve notes. That's the monopoly currency of the government through the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve also has the central planning authority to determine how much money will be injected into the economy, when, and in what magnitudes. They also, through that, have the ability, given people's demand to use money for purposes, by controlling the supply, can attempt to influence and manipulate the value of money, the purchasing power of money, the prices of goods and services in the economy. And they also have the ability, since the primary institutional mechanism that they use to inject money into the economy is by buying government securities and creating new money in the purchase of it. And then that money flows into the banks. The banks have more money to lend, reserves as it's called. And how do you attract more people to buy your product if you have more to sell? Well, you lower the price, right? You put things on sale. In the case of the Federal Reserve and the banking system, if the Fed creates more lending reserves and the banks now have more money to lend, they then, therefore, are induced to lower interest rates with the newly created money, and therefore they create an investment and an inflationary boom. Those are the mechanisms by which the Federal Reserve has this monopoly control over money. Now, as you also correctly said a few minutes ago, it is vital for there to be an auditing of any government agency. We know this. We know this because every federal agency is dealing with taxpayer money. And since they control or have over taxpayer money, it is necessary for there to be an accountability. Therefore, whether it be the Department of Defense, the Department of the Veterans Administration, and so on, all are expected to be audited. Congress appropriates money and they direct its use. Are the bureaucrats in charge properly allocating and using that money so there's no misappropriation, fraud, or abuse? It would be expected that as a chartered agency of the Congress, the Federal Reserve should be open to the same audit. How are they using their power? What type of assets are they buying? When the crash came in 2008 and 2009, and the Federal Reserve, to try to prevent what they viewed was a threat of a new Great Depression, began up, besides government securities, began to buy up mortgage-backed securities. How many securities did they buy? What value did they have when they purchased them? And what would be the estimated value now, or if they tried to sell them? In other words, what is on the portfolio of the Federal Reserve? We know nothing about this. So it is legitimate, as those who are the citizens of the country, the government should be accountable, including an agency like the Federal Reserve. But as you rightly point out, an audit and accountability in that bureaucratic sense is in itself not the ultimate problem. The ultimate problem is the fact that the Federal Reserve has this monopoly power and prevents the market from determining what shall be used as money, what its value will be, allowing banking systems to properly act as the intermediary between people who choose to save their income in the society and those who wish to borrow portions of it for investment purposes, so that there's a proper matching of supply and demand of savings and investment, so the economy is kept on an even keel through competitive market forces. That is what the Federal Reserve prevents through its central planning. And therefore, while an auditing is important, the ultimate goal is the privatization, the denationalization, the separating of money from the state. And that has to be an ultimate goal of all friends of freedom looking to the rest of this century.
Yeah, when you talk about the market, I mean, that really is the alternative. But it's so difficult, I think, for many, many people to conceive this, like many other parts of the welfare warfare state apparatus, that most of us have been born and raised under this kind of system. And of course, they've inculcated Americans with the idea that America is a capitalist country, that it is a free market system. And so the average person goes through years, what I call the 12-year sentence in public schools, arrives at 18 years of age, convinced that apparatuses like the central bank, the Federal Reserve, is all part and parcel of a free market society, given that we supposedly live in a free market society. But really what I'm talking about in a free market, is one in which government has no role at all in the monetary sphere. That's difficult for people to conceive of, because now all of a sudden we're just talking about people buying and selling, and in that process, a medium of exchange surfaces. That's probably gold coins, it's silver coins, privately minted, but it doesn't have to be. It could be something that we haven't even thought of. It could be bitcoins. It could be something that spontaneously comes about that no one could plan for. And if you take that construct of just people freely interacting with each other and then compare it to what we have, then you can really see the difference, because you've got this central planning agency that is planning in a top-down command and control manner a very complex subject, money, for millions and millions of people. And the person that I think, the Austrian economist that I think has had the greatest insights in this is Friedrich Hayek, where Hayek talks about the conceit of the planner, that these guys actually think they have the requisite knowledge, even with all the computers and stuff, to plan this complex economic activity that really should be left to a free people. And so that's why you end up with these booms and busts and bubbles and Great Depressions and recessions and depressions and all, because there is no way that these guys know what the right rate of interest is, the right supply of money, what the demand for money is, because things are constantly changing.
We live in an extremely complex, interactive society. As Hayek pointed out in his famous article, The Use of Knowledge in Society, the originality of which was one of the reasons that the Nobel Prize Committee awarded him the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974, was Hayek emphasized that knowledge is dispersed, decentralized, and spread out among all the people of a society, and of course now a global society of trade, commerce, and so on, including financial trading. And as a consequence, there is no way that any individual or group of individuals, no matter how wise, intelligent, and well-meaning, can integrate, coordinate, and master plan all of these bits of knowledge in the society, which includes the financial markets, the monetary relationships of the society, what prices should be, and out of these prices, the general value of a unit of money. None of them can know this other than allowing individuals to use their knowledge as they think best in the pursuit of their own interests. But as Adam Smith emphasized, as of an invisible hand, the market coordinates the actions of multitudes through the information and the signals of prices, telling demanders what suppliers believe they can supply goods at and at what prices and how much, and suppliers then knowing what demanders want and think they can bring to market to earn a profit. That is the only mechanism. The other thing that I would just mention, you correctly said that people have gotten so used to this institution that they can't imagine the opposite. Think of that, let's say, for the last 100 years, government had been in the shoe business. 100 years ago, they had said that shoes are too important to leave to the private sector. What will happen to the poor or the little children whose feet grow regularly? Can we this leave to the uncertainties of parental decision-making or the wiles of the marketplace that might not make shoes for growing little kids? So as a consequence, imagine that the government had nationalized the shoe industry. It had centrally planned shoe production. It had artificially set the price of shoes so everyone could afford a pair of shoes, and distributed shoes for the children, Now, someone like you and I, 100 years later, comes along and says, what the hell is the government doing in the shoe business? Why can't shoes be private like the shirts we buy or the pants we buy or the coffee we drink? If the market can supply coffee, which people like, even children sometimes, why can't they do shoes? And how would people respond to such an argument by you and me, Jacob? They would say things, but how can you be sure that the market will give people the shoes they need in the sizes and qualities and varieties? And what about people with feet-free conditions, bunioned people? Will bunion people get the right shoes? I mean, there'd be all these rationales, excuses, and kickbacks. Oh, we can't trust the market to supply shoes. It's the institutional inertia that people cannot imagine what, in fact, the market does in multitudes of ways that we take for granted, in fact, don't think about, but delivers the goods in the ways, shapes, and forms that we desire, and usually at prices that more or less we're willing to pay. But once the government has monopolized it for a while, people cannot imagine the alternative. The institutional inertia makes it difficult, and therefore the cultural inertia makes it difficult to imagine that government doesn't need to do X any more than it needs to do Y or Z. And that's an intellectual argument. It's a knowledge argument. It's a logic argument and a common sense argument. But there's no reason why, in principle, we can't win that any less, than back in the late 70s and early 80s, the arguments were one for deregulating the airline industry, for instance. So it could, or parts of a number of other industries. So it can happen, but it requires overcoming the inertia of imagining a world in which it would not be possible.
Yeah, the average person would look at this program and say, oh, I would never fall for the shoe business. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But then we can turn to real-life examples of central planning and socialist structures like public schooling or the postal service, where people say, how would people get their education if the state wasn't providing it? Everybody would be stupid and uneducated without the state. Or how would people get their mail if the postal service weren't delivering their mail? And how would people in the mountains get their mail? Oh, yeah, they can get their shoes and their milk, but they could never get their mail if the government wasn't providing it.
Absolutely.
You've got this new book coming out through FFF, Monetary Central Planning in the State. It's coming out any day now. We're wrapping up. Richard's done a fantastic introduction to it, and we're polishing up that introduction, and so it should be ready in the next week or so. But Richard, in your introduction to Monetary Central Planning in the State, you mentioned this idea of quantitative easing. And what the Fed's been doing with that. And if I understand it correctly, what the Fed's been doing with these zero interest rates effectively is trying to inject, new energy into the economy, which they've been doing for decades. They use the vehicle of the state, the Federal Reserve, to try to bring, growth to an economy. And even instinctively, I mean, a person should know that this is just nonsense. I mean, if a government could do that, every nation on earth would be tremendously prosperous, including Zimbabwe, where they expanded the money supply, a millionfold. But would you talk a little bit about what really happened with quantitative easing, why we don't see a huge increase in prices that we would ordinarily think that we would see with an expansion of the money supply? Tell us a little bit of how much the money supply has been expanded and what we might expect in the future.
Well, let me just put this in just the context of what preceded it, if you will, to talk about that. In 2003, then Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan and then the Vice Chairman Ben Bernanke, they were afraid that the American economy was going to go into a tailspin of deflation, that is, falling prices. And since the Great Depression of the 1930s, falling prices has been defined as depressionary. Falling prices means unprofitability. Falling prices means low demand. It doesn't have to mean that. But that's how they interpreted it. So between 2003 and 2008, the Federal Reserve increased, as using different measurements that they themselves calculate, increased the money supply by approximately 50%. And through those years, interest rates through increasing bank reserves for lending purposes were nominally very low, and when adjusted for inflation by the Consumer Price Index, for instance, were actually negative. Then they got a little panicky in 2007 that this could become a serious, inflationary boom. There was the housing bubble, there was the investment bubble, and they decided to take their foot off the money-creating pedal, if you will. And that's when the stock market came down and the real economy was affected, and the housing market, which already had been under decline, went through the floor. That persuaded the then chairman, Ben Bernanke, who had been and has been a professor at Princeton University. He's considered an expert on the history of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And as an expert, he was determined under his watch at the Federal Reserve never to allow a similar economic decline and fall as it happened in the 1930s. And he would do anything in his power institutionally to preclude it. So beginning in 2008, 2009, when they interpreted this as foreboding another Great Depression, they undertook this massive monetary expansion that between 2009 and today has increased the money supply in the form of reserves in the banking system by buying U.S. government securities, those mortgage-backed securities, the toxic waste securities that was part of the housing boom, but not so much valuable when the boom fell. They bought all these up to the tune of $4 trillion, approximately $4 trillion. And they infused that into the banking system. Now, you would logically expect that if that was the situation, even with unemployment and factories not operating at full capacity, within short order, we would have seen more price inflation, no matter how you're measuring it, than we have seen, because the Consumer Price Index has bumped around between approximately 1.5% to about 2% at an annual rate since 2009. The reason is that the Fed, Ben Bernanke, to prevent a bank collapse, infused all this money into the banking system to shore up the capital position of the banks. They would have sufficient reserves to meet any contingency. The people wouldn't have to worry about bank runs like in the 1930s. And 8,000 banks did fail in the early 30s. But what he did then, and what the Federal Reserve has done ever since, is to play this game. Rather than induce and stimulate the banks to, with $4 trillion worth of lending money, to just pump it out as investment loans, consumer loans, new home loans, they started playing a little institutional or gimmicky game where they began to pay banks about 0.25% or so higher than they could earn by lending that money to you, me, the home buyer, the businessman, just a little bit higher if they would not lend the money. In other words, being paid to leave it parked as unlent reserves, in the tune of almost $3 trillion of the $4 trillion. Last time I saw the numbers, approximately $2.8 trillion. Now, that is basically why you have not seen the catastrophic and artificial boom and significant price inflation that all other things held given would have occurred if all of that money had flooded into the market. So the Fed, in fact, created all this money, was afraid of its own effects, and therefore have been paying the banks not to lend the money they created. And that's partly what has been going on with the quantitative easing. Just enough money, right, about over $1 trillion of new money to push interest rates very low, to partly stimulate a new housing bubble, because housing prices, again, when adjusted for inflation, have been very low. When you adjust for inflation, home mortgages for the last 7 or 8 years have averaged in real cost terms between 1.5% to 2.5%. That's a very low real mortgage cost. The same thing with investment lending. So this is partly the reason why we've seen this artificial recovery in certain parts of the sectors, but not as bad as an avalanche of currency debasement as would have occurred if the Fed didn't manipulate for its own money creation not to be lent to us.
So what happens if the Fed, is there any possibility the Fed would stop paying that excess amount, which would then free up all that money for loans? Am I reading that wrong?
Yes. You see, some analysts have precisely pointed this out, Jacob, that these banks are only not lending this money because they have been paid to park it there and earn money by not doing anything with it. But what if interest rates start rising, or the economy starts experiencing a real, more or less stable recovery, and businessmen seeing prospective future profitabilities want to borrow money for what they view as reasonable investment opportunities, and that money starts flooding the market? That puts the Federal Reserve into one of two positions, it seems to me. They either have to start taking those reserves out of the banking system. What does that mean? It means that they offer to buy money by reselling the Treasury securities and the mortgage-backed securities that they have accumulated in their investment portfolio. Okay, now what's the consequence of that? Well, if they suck money out and sell U.S. Treasury securities and mortgages, that's going to put downward pressure on U.S. securities because of the increased supply offered to investment portfolio holders, and if they sell the mortgage-backed securities, that's going to be lowering the value of secondary homes by those mortgages coming on the market in the financial markets. All of this would therefore push down housing prices and bring a halt to whatever housing recovery that they've tried to stimulate. Now, the other alternative of this would be for them to allow interest rates up, or themselves to try to nudge the key interest rates that they try to manipulate, such as the federal funds rate and the one-year Treasury security. Those are the key rates that they try to manipulate. If they allow them to rise or push them up, however, they then have to raise that little amount again, so that even though the interest rates are rising, they have that gimmick rate that still results in an incentive for the banks not to lend all the reserves that the Federal Reserve has created. Those are really their two leading options. Now, I never underestimate their creativity of interventionists and government monetary manipulators. They may figure out a new creative way to massage and manipulate the system. But that's basically their two leading alternatives: either sucking the reserves out by reselling securities and mortgages, or by raising the rate of interest that they charge the banks above whatever new higher market rate is present.
Well, whatever they do, it's just what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos. And as we've talked about in previous shows, I mean, that's what brought on the Great Depression, that, the stock market crash in 29, that we're all taught, oh, no, it's the failure of free enterprise. But it was really because the Fed overcontracted, or it didn't expand enough. And I think that was why Bernanke in that dinner in honor of Milton Friedman said, Friedman, you were right, because Friedman talked about the Fed having caused the stock market crash in 29 through monetary manipulation. And so, I mean, we're back to where we started, this whole idea of central planning. They cannot know how to do something this complex. It just creates ultimate chaos and crises.
Right. You see, the advantage of the market in these monetary and financial and banking affairs is that in the simplest but no less fundamentally true sort of way of saying it, people earn income, and they divide their income basically into two categories: spending or saving. If they save part of their money, they would like to earn interest income. So they deposit their savings in financial institutions, banks. And banks, acting as their intermediary, pool everyone else's savings and then funnel it out to willing and interested borrowers who hope to borrow that money for profitable endeavors that will justify borrowing the money, earning a profit, and earning enough to pay back the money and still have a net gain. Now, how do you balance people's decision to save and those interested in borrowing? Well, like any other supply and demand in the market, there's a price that brings a balance, a coordination, a clearing between one side and the other side. That's what the purpose of the rate of interest is. It is a market price that coordinates savers' decisions with borrowers' desires to invest, generally. As a consequence, the Federal Reserve is distorting all of this. They create the false impression that there's more savings in the economy through money creation as bank reserves than is actually the case of real savings representing a portion of the society's scarce resources. And at the same time, they distort the information going to investors with a lower than market rate of interest, making it seem that savings is plentiful. There's plenty of savings in terms of real resources to go around to undertake new investments, expand existing investment projects, have longer time horizons with investments that, in fact, at the end of the day, are inconsistent with each other, where too many investments and the wrong type of investments and the wrong time horizon investments have been undertaken relative to the available savings to sustain and maintain them. And when that finally breaks, then you have the downturn following the boom. And it's inevitable. You cannot take scarce resources and twist them into more directions than the resources permit to be used for.
Yeah, and Friedman, I remember he was one of the great advocates of reforming the Fed, and he said, well, let's just set a maximum amount of money growth in society, like 2% or something. And even that creates distortions. I mean, it's misleading people, as you point out, and especially in the business community. It's creating the sense that there's 2% savings that just don't exist. So you're still going to create these distortions in these crises. But I remember reading Friedman's proposal for a constitutional amendment. It was this complex, enormous, wordy type thing that there was no way a court could ever enforce it. And but I remember, to Friedman's credit, that later on in his life, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that he came around to say, my ideal would be to abolish the Fed. But if you're given it its existence, here's how to reform it. But the best is to just abolish it. It seems to me, Richard, that's the only solution to this. Restore a genuine free market, honest money, genuine money, free market money to our nation, a separation of money and the state, if you will, and that necessarily entails abolishing the Fed.
Yes, I have actually a chapter in this new book of mine, which FFF is publishing, on monetary central planning in the state, on Milton Friedman's second thoughts on monetary reform. He wrote a series of articles after he won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1976. These basically appeared in the 1980s. In a nutshell, what he said in one article was a presidential address before the Western Economic Association in 1986. He said that he now realizes that his idea of the Federal Reserve following a rule, hell or high water, you don't manipulate the money supply. It just increases, quote, automatically by 2% or 3% a year, hands off the throttle. That was never going to work, because the temptations by bureaucrats and politicians will always, as long as they have control of a monetary printing press handle, will always be used in an abusive and manipulated and short-term way to serve the interests of those in political power. That he was wrong. And then in another article he wrote about the same time, he said that he's not ready to advocate a gold standard, but he had often argued for a paper money, because he said having a paper money is less costly than devoting and allocating real resources that could make shoes and hats and grow bananas just to mine gold, mint it into coins, and store it away into a vault. But looking over the 20th century from the perspective of the 1980s at that time, looking over the 20th century, what Friedman said was that all things considered, the roller coasters of booms and busts and the inflation that had disrupted and distorted the functioning of the market economy had been far more costly than anything that would have been costed if we had had a commodity standard like gold. In other words, the cost of mining and minting and storing gold would have been much lower cost to society than the cost of booms and busts and inflations. And therefore, it would have been better in principle if there had never been the Federal Reserve and its monopoly and then issuance of paper money.
Yeah, it really goes to show you the power of ideas. I mean, people start reflecting on ideas that they either opposed or hadn't given much thought to, and all of a sudden the ground shifts. And I find it absolutely fascinating that there's people on the left. I mean, who would have ever thought that abolish the Fed would become like a popular campaign slogan 25 years ago when you and I were writing on these things, Richard? I mean, it was like, yeah, who was ever going to think about abolishing the Fed? And now you've got these Occupy movements where they're talking about abolish the Fed. I saw one in L.A. I was walking by an Occupy movement, and a guy was holding up a banner that said abolish the Fed. And I said, you know what? This shows you the power of ideas. And I think that we may very well see this idea coming onto the table and be a part of the popular debate discussion in this country. In the event, we're out of time,
yes,
Richard. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, if that comes, a major building block of the socialist ideological edifice will have been torn down. As Reagan said, tear down that central bank wall.
Yeah, and again, this brings us back full circle, that it is a socialist construct, that here you have a society purportedly based on freedom and free markets that has this enormous socialist construct that operates, of course, in conjunction with the IRS, really to plunder and loot people and create distortions and perversions and crises and really what Mises called planned chaos. On that note, we got to wrap things up. Richard, enjoyed it as always, and we will see you next week.